our webinar. Good luck.
Hello and welcome to the first in a series of webinars that we're running for the bioscience education community in support of the publication of our new introductory bioscience text, A Biological Science Exploring the Science of Life. I'm John Crowe, Editor-in-Chief for Natural and Social Sciences in the UK Higher Ed Department, OUP, and also the Commissioning Editor for this project. I'm delighted to be joined today by four of the authors of this project in alphabetical order, just to keep things nice and neutral. They are Martin Luck, who's Emeritus Professor of Physiological Education at the University of Nottingham, John Scott, who's a Higher Ed Consultant and Emeritus Professor of Bioscience Education at the University of Leicester, Alison Snape, who's Professor of Bioscience Education at King's College London, and Kay Yeoman, who's Professor of Science Communication and Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Learning and Teaching Enhancement at the University of East Anglia. And they're united by a common and long-standing passion for effective teaching and learning as it relates to the study of biological science, and in developing and promoting teaching practices that support this. And it's this collective passion and interest that we're really trying to draw upon during the development of our project to address the particular needs of our academic community and the challenges we all face. I'm also joined by my colleague Stephanie Southall-Paddock, who's Senior Development Editor in my team, who will be contributing later on when we come to the Q&A session. So the first half of this session, Martin, John, Alison and Kay will discuss the various challenges faced by those teaching biological science and how we can respond to those challenges to help students think like biologists more effectively. And then we'll then move on to a Q&A session. So I'd invite you all to add your questions into the Q&A function at any time while we're discussing, and then we'll come to those questions in the second half of the session. We'll look forward to responding to as many of those questions as we can later on. So without further ado, let's begin. So the first topic we want to think about, and I'll come to you, the panel, is what you see to be the fundamental challenges associated with teaching bioscience to introductory students. Kay, can I come to you? Oh, yep. That was good.
Yeah, it's really about our students coming from a whole variety of different backgrounds. So we have a large proportion of students who come in, obviously, with traditional A-levels, but that's not the case for every institution that they'd make up the majority. We have many institutions where perhaps fewer than 50% actually come from this traditional A-level background. Others are coming in from BTEC courses, from widening access courses in further education. And many of our students have been out of education for some considerable time and they're coming back into education as mature learners. So we can't assume that every single student is coming in from a traditional background. So we have to think about how our students have acquired their biological sciences knowledge and how they then apply that knowledge to concepts. And so we need to be very mindful of that as we've been writing this book.
Great, thank you. Alison, what about you? What do you think one of the fundamental challenges is?
So to me, one of the challenges is the breadth of what biology actually is and what it encompasses, because people, again, come from very different backgrounds and what they think biology is and what they've learned about. So we're going right from biochemistry and molecular biology up to whole body physiology, and we're going then into ecology. So biology is really an enormous subject, and that, I think, it's a challenge to teach it, it's a challenge to know about it, it's a challenge for our students to come in and find out where they sit and what they want to focus on.
Great, thank you. And John, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think picking up from what Kay and Alison have said, I think one of the other main transitional features is that particularly A-level courses, but most college and school education is based around facts and factual recall. If you look at current A-level papers, a lot of it is about remembering facts and that sort of rote learning. And what we want at university is to transition the students from focusing on facts to thinking about and understanding the concepts, so they can demonstrate understanding of the principles of biological sciences rather than simply the facts. And some of those some of the concepts are quite complex and difficult to get across. And that's a lot of the work we do in first year teaching, and a lot of what we're aiming at with this book is to produce a bed from which they can develop their understanding of the concepts.
Right, great, thank you. Yeah, Martin, what do you think?
Yes, I think one of the important features of that understanding is that it gives the student the opportunity then to understand new material as it comes along. Biology is a rapidly developing subject, whatever specialism you're in. And it would be impossible just to teach facts pretending that things are as they are. We have to be aware that biological information changes, that new information is coming along all the time. And what a student needs to be able to do is understand that, not necessarily remember everything they've been told, but be able to address new material as it comes in and to treat biology as a developing subject. And I think we've all written our elements of the book with that in mind, that we're trying to not prepare students for a curriculum, but to give them the tools they need in order to see how information is changing all the time and how they can deal with it.
Right. And then during the project as a whole, now we've talked a lot about the fact that biology is inherently quantitative. Kay, do you want to elaborate on that as a challenge?
Yes, that's right. Biology does require quantitative skills, and obviously that is taught as part of an A-level curriculum or a BTEC curriculum. So our students do come in with biological sciences quantitative skills, but we need to develop those further. So our biology students, many of them do have maths, but many of them don't. So we have to make sure that our students all have the skills in order to be able to access the quantitative parts of biology. And that requires some sensitivity, I think, because some students feel unconfident in terms of their numerical ability. They have numerical ability, they don't always recognise that they have it. And quite often I find, certainly, my students try to overcomplicate the mathematics that is in biology. And it's about calming them down and ensuring that all of the steps in a quantitative approach are clearly explained. And then by providing that confidence, the students will then succeed. So it's about mirroring that in the writing that we've had in the book. So whenever we do have quantitative skills, we take the students through things step by step, and that's the key to their success.
I guess also, Martin, we've talked before, that very often biology can have this perception of not being a particularly quantitative subject, which I guess isn't helpful.
Yes, it's not uncommon in my experience to meet students who have been guided towards biological subjects at school precisely because they felt uncomfortable with numerical work in say, physics or maths or the hard sciences in general. That's very disappointing, because I think it's, on the one hand, suggesting to students that biology is a second best option, that it's an easier option when it certainly isn't. And also it's giving them the sense that biology is just going to be descriptive rather than analytical or quantitative, which, as has just been said, is completely the wrong idea. And if you think about the careers biological students are going to go into, the increasing importance of modeling in biology and the importance of big data, it's very clear that some concept of data handling and the ability to cope with numerical and analytical material is going to be important to them. They won't be able to get away from that. So we need to overcome that barrier or that misapprehension about what biology really is.
So we've thought there about the challenges associated with teaching biology generally. Are there any particular challenges you think associated with our education system?
I think that's an interesting question, John. And I think some of that stems from the fact that in our UK education system, we tend to get our students to specialise quite early. They only choose 3 A levels, for example, sometimes 4, but majority it's 3. So they become very limited in their choices very early on, and that's not the case in other curriculum in other parts of the world. In the United States, for example, they have a much broader curriculum to a much older age, and so there's a broader knowledge. But I think what our students, when they do come to us, they do come to us with a depth of factual knowledge. Perhaps not necessarily conceptual knowledge, but they do have facts at their disposal, and that is what we do see in our education system. But that breadth and depth of other subject discipline isn't there. So as we've alluded to, so you don't have to do maths at A level to do biology, and some students would marry biology with their chemistry. Others would actually mix the arts and the sciences together, and maybe they would have done English, biology, and psychology, for example. So they do come in with different subjects, but that whole breadth of it. So you can drop other sciences and still go on in to do your biology degree. So it's interesting how our education system has not allowed that to develop, because I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. You just have to be sensitive to it when the students come to university.
Yeah, can I just chip in as well and really concur with Kay, because at King's we do get most of our students coming in with A levels, and they have biology and chemistry because we require it. Very rarely do we get students with biology, chemistry, physics and maths. And in fact, to study biology, you do need a smattering of all of these subjects. So what we're trying to do is cater for the students who have different parcels of knowledge, but cope with the fact that virtually none of them have everything that we need. So we're dealing with students, some of whom are pretty confident in some areas, some of whom are much less confident in those same areas, and having to cater for all of them. So I think that is a challenge, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, Martin, any challenges about the education system that come to mind for you?
Yes, I think there's a strong tradition in UK universities of making teaching research-led, at least in the later stages of the course. And I think this is very valuable because it alludes back to that idea that information is uncertain, that what you know is transient, and that by doing some research you can find out more about it. So we tend to teach from that point of view. But if we're going to teach from that point of view, we have to make students realize that experimentation and investigation never have a certain outcome. They never have a known outcome. If they did, there'd be no point in doing it. And one of the things we emphasized in our chapters is that the information that people have obtained is based on investigation, setting hypotheses and testing them, but really discovery as a complement to understanding. And that then gets students away again from this idea that there is a curriculum they have to learn, that if they can understand rather than learn information, that when they do their own research and get unexpected results or new results, they're in a strong position to be able to interpret it and make the right sort of judgments about it. I'm not sure if it's just the UK that takes this approach, I have to say, but I know there are parts of the world where it applies certainly less. And many of the textbooks that exist in biology tend not to emphasize the research side of the subject as much as one might hope they would.
John.
And I think picking up on what Martin said, we've seen, as we all know, lecturing within UK higher education and colleges, the students do progress quite rapidly towards specialization. And that's all to the good because, as we know, biological sciences is a really broad-based subject. Mm-hmm. But also we were very mindful of providing a course structure that would suit first-year biosciences students as when they take this book. And one of the features, for example, of a lot of universities now is their courses are accredited by professional bodies. For example, the Royal Society of Biology accredits a large number of biosciences programs across the UK. And they require quite a broad base for the students to have as their footing before they specialise. So the standard first year curriculum would be everything from molecular biology through to ecology and conservation biology, with everything in between. And there's an expectation by organisations like the RSB that students will have that grounding before they specialise, and that's something that they're looking for. And so again, that's something we thought about quite carefully within the design of this book.
And I guess there are also challenges, not particular to our education system. The other day we were talking, Kay, about impact of COVID, for example.
That's right. So yes, that's not unique to us, of course. It's a global pandemic, but we can't underestimate the impact that that has had on our young people as they come into university, and that impact is going to be long lasting. It impacts those students who were doing GCSEs a little while ago, and when they feed through into university, they may have some shaky knowledge, lack of confidence coming through into their A levels or other qualifications. So it's an impact that we need to be aware of, and it's going to be a long-reaching one. We are, and I'm sure all universities are, very mindful of that and putting into place packages to help students with gaps in their knowledge, because we know that the exam bodies recommended that not all of the content was taught, and that could be very different for different exam bodies. And so we need to level all of our students to they get to the same position, so that when they transition out from level 4, their first year, into their second year, they all have the knowledge and the skills to be able to succeed in their second and third years, and then go on to succeed elsewhere. But we can't underestimate it, and we've got to keep an eye on it all the time. And this textbook, whilst it wasn't written to plug a COVID gap, does in fact provide the necessary depth of information and the questioning and the the research aspects which would enable a student to fill in those knowledge gaps for themselves.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So thought there,
John, if I may, could I just come in with a further challenge before we kind of move off this very briefly, and that's, I think, getting students to use language in the right way. We want students to use great precision in their biological language, but we also want them to understand the way in which biological organisms and parts of organisms like cells and tissues and organs work, without interpreting those functions in the wrong direction. We're all experts on COVID and viruses now as a result of what's gone on. And if you listen to the radio and you read newspapers or magazines, very frequently you find that the teleological language, for example, is widespread. T cells I was hearing about this morning are purposeful in the way they deal with the virus, apparently. What we really have to get across to students is this is not how biology works. Biological systems have evolved, and those that are around us are the ones which were successful in doing what they do. And we have to get across that kind of precise language so that students don't perpetuate some of the myths that are going on in more colloquial speaking.
Great. Thanks, Martin. Yeah. So if we move on now to how we can actually respond to some of the challenges, rather than just being things that are out there to defeat us, what we can do kind of proactively to address them. So thinking firstly about that different experience of students coming into biological science study at university, and also that shift towards a more applied understanding rather than kind of knowledge retention, which tends to be the model at school. John, coming to you first, how can we respond to those?
Yeah, thanks, John. Again, it's a really important issue, and that we touched on it a little bit earlier on. We were talking about transitions from A-level and BTEC and so on into university. And I think one of the significant features of this book is all the people who are on the writing team have extensive experience of teaching first-year students. We understand where they're coming from, and we've worked with first-year students and helped their progression for a long time. And so the way we've written the book, the writing style is designed to engage the students so that they can find it approachable and accessible, and so that different students from different backgrounds can find it accessible regardless of their previous experience. And that's really important. So we're taking the students on that journey with us, and it's a journey that we've worked with students on for a number of years. And we also talked about conceptual understanding, and that's one of the things that we've worked on quite hard within the design of the book. So, for example, we've incorporated pause and think elements, whereby we're getting the reader to stop and think about a concept initially before they move on, just to make sure that they're happy with it, and to question themselves as well, to think about their understanding. And in particular, we're focused on liminal concepts, so these sort of threshold concepts that we know students find particularly difficult. And I'm a neuroscientist, and for example, I know quite a few of those liminal concepts around, for example, membrane potentials and things like that, that students really find challenging to get their heads around. And that's also going to be supported not just by the text, but also by the online materials that have been prepared. So, for example, there's video material that will be available that presents key concepts through another route, so that students can look at things and engage with the material in different ways as they work through that. So I think we thought about the first year student really carefully in what we're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, and Martin, I know the approach that you took to your module in particular kind of was really there to reinforce understanding rather than just lots of disparate bits of knowledge.
Yes, just to explain to everybody, the module that I've been working on is dealing with whole organisms in particular. So I cover the structure of whole organisms, but I also talk about how they exist in the environments they find themselves in, and how they react to environmental imperatives. And when I set out to create this, I decided to take a slightly different approach from the traditional one. I mean, traditionally, one would look at organisms of different sizes, maybe from archaea and the single-celled organisms, and then move up in a sort of structured way through the animal kingdom, and then through the plant kingdom, and so on. I decided to take a rather different approach and to treat all living organisms as essentially of equal footing in the biosphere, and then to compare how they react to the imperatives that biosphere throws at them. So one might think about gravity or temperature or light or the humid environment or the gases that they need to breathe and so on, and to see how different organisms right across the spectrum deal with these imperatives. So you'll find plants and animals side by side. You'll see insects next to fish. You'll find sponges next to mammals, simply because these are all living organisms and they're all experiencing those environmental imperatives and surviving within them. And so that's the approach I've taken. And the aim there really is to give the student a perception of what the biological world is like, not what plants are like or what animals are like, but what the biological world as a whole is like, and how organisms evolve and then survive and reproduce within them, within that spectrum.
Thank you. And obviously, quantitative skills, another big area we've taken a lot of time to think about how we address that. John, if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, both Kay and Martin have touched a little bit on quantitative skills already, and we all see them as a really important part of biosciences, and we need to support the students in understanding how the quantitative elements fit in, and also how to engage with them effectively. And so you can't shy away from it. There's in my area, again, within neuroscience, we've got things like the Nernst equation and so on that students have to be able to tackle in order to understand membrane potentials. And so you can't shy away from it, but we've built in structures that will help them to navigate their way through so they can understand it and learn how to apply it. So it isn't just a case of knowing the numbers, but actually the important element is how to apply those quantitative skills, and how those quantitative skills and the quantitative elements then help understand how the systems are working. And I think Cade has done a lot of work on growth populations, which you'll probably pick up on.
Yes, that's right. So in my area, I'm a microbiologist. So one of the things that I do, and we've got in the book, is microbial growth kinetics. So how organisms grow logarithmically. So there are quantitative skills around explaining those processes, but it's also about how microbes go through their log phase of growth into their stationary phase and into decline, and what are the models that are used to describe that, and in fact what is the biology which is going on there. It's important to understand these, because unless you understand them, you can't then manipulate them, and manipulating them is really important if you're going to make microbial products, pharmaceuticals for example, like antibiotics. So it's vital from a biologist's point of view that we understand the mathematics that sit behind these biological processes, because it enables us to to understand it for understanding's sake, which is also important, but to be able to manipulate it for gain, for human gain. Biotechnology is based a lot around being able to produce very useful products. But also we find that students can struggle at times with units as well, and then conversion between units. So and magnitude and sizes is always something that they struggle with initially. And whilst that's fairly straightforward, it's around confidence. These students do know it, but they just need to have things reinforced to them before they get onto the more complex material. So when students, for example, are enumerating how many bacterial cells are in a growth suspension, they've got to be able to understand dilutions. They've got to be able to understand powers, and they've got to be able to work backwards. So once they've plated out a 10 to the -6 dilution, they need to know that that is a millionfold dilution. They need to understand the volume that they're spread on a plate so that they can calculate back to the number of bacteria per mil, or indeed per sample, per 20 mil sample, for example. So being able to go down and go back up again in terms of scale is hugely important in the biological sciences, and the quantitative skills enables and supports that learning for the students within the book.
Yeah, and we'll have another webinar in this series that focuses explicitly on how we're supporting quantitative skills through the project, which we're looking forward to in the spring. As we also noticed, how curricula in the UK are more varied. There's no kind of one-size-fits-all approach, and students need this broader introduction to act as a stepping stone to their more specialised study. So then how are you responding to that challenge? Martin, do you want to lead on that?
Yes, and the book, as we're calling it a book, but it's more than a book. It is divided up into chapters, but the sort of substructure to that is a modular structure. So there are broad collections of modules that each of us has been responsible for, but we're conscious that students are following a very wide range of specialisms eventually in their biological studies, and indeed they come in on a wide variety of titled courses. So we can't anticipate the curriculum that each student needs to follow. And so we would anticipate that students would want to mix and match amongst the modules and amongst the chapters within the modules. There are probably some combinations that are going to be more useful than others, or more frequently useful than others, but we've made lots of cross-references within the text pointing to where students can find out more information on particular areas if that's what they need to do. And we hope that staff will use the resources in that way, including the online resources, and guide students towards the material that they might find most useful, rather than identifying a particular module and saying this is the one you have to learn. This might be your starting point, but you might also find useful information in several other places. So it's very much a mix and match approach, and that's been a challenge in the writing, but we hope that we've written it in such a way that it encourages students to look beyond what might be the narrow confines of a subject title.
Alison, or can you
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think particularly attractive to me is the way that the book is much more flexible than a lot of the very big sort of doorstop introductory biology texts that you can get. So you can buy into particular modular structures. And as Martin was saying, when we were writing, I mean, certainly the module that I was involved with, which is the molecular one, I was very conscious that I needed to make it stand alone if anybody wants to use it that way, but also make sure that there was lots of signposting to other modules, different parts of the book, if people wanted to use it that way and link things together. So I think it's going to be very flexible for lecturers who can use it in the way that they want, and as Martin said, for students as well.
Yeah, and that's definitely been the approach. As I both said, I think the cross-referencing is a really important part of this, so that students can refer across to the different areas, but don't have to follow the book from page 1 to infinity, however many pages they're going to be at the end. So the elements can stand alone, but the students can very easily find their way around if there are, for example, again, picking up on the neuroscience, if there's something about membrane biology that they need to look at, then there's cross-references that will take them to those elements within molecular and cell biology that will allow them to provide the other perspective on that element of, say, membrane biology. And so they can help build their understanding, but they don't need to follow the book all the way through. So it is designed to be very flexible and to be accessible irrespective of how the course that they're following at university is structured, which modules come first, which topics come first. So we thought about that very carefully from our own experience of first year teaching.
And I guess there are benefits, pedagogically to those cross-references as well. Alison, what do you think on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think because I think all of us now experience modular degrees, and the big danger with those is that students really compartmentalize information and they don't carry the information across. But the way to deep learning and true understanding and being able to apply your knowledge is to be able to link subject areas together. So I think this sort of cross-referencing and bringing things across from one module to the next and one chapter to the next will hopefully, it's useful to the students because they learn, but it also models to them a way of thinking that will be very beneficial to them in their future studies.
And thinking about the future studies, I think the other element is that we are looking to draw the students on so that it isn't a book that they would just give up on at the end of the first year. It's a book that's designed to lead them into their specializations in the second year so they can be being prepared for that. And so again, that structure, the cross-referencing and the way in which the material is presented is designed to lead them on from first year into those areas of specialization.
Right. And Martin, then what about, students who don't necessarily know what they're going to go on to do? They might not really have a sense of that yet.
That's right. I mean, obviously some students come to university with a career in mind. Some of them definitely don't. In fact, probably the majority don't, or the majority have decided they're going to take a certain direction in their studies because it's interesting, not because they see a career of a particular kind. And it might be that when they get to university, they don't actually know what a subject involves. They don't know what it covers, and equally they might meet subjects which they've never even thought of before, let alone encountered. And so this concept of having a broad resource which will support interest going in lots of different directions should be very useful for students like that. and also for students who have set out in one direction and then suddenly decide they want to go in another. I mean, we should be flexible enough in encouraging our students to change their points of view and change their directions if that's appropriate to them. And I know we've taken that attitude right the way through. On the subject of supporting material from lots of different directions, I was thinking of two examples which have come up during our author group discussions. One which John mentioned, which was membranes. Membranes appear in lots of different guises right throughout biology, and John's talked about the sort of approach he takes in neurobiology. But structural biology, of course, involves membranes right as a fundamental concept, and membranes come into biochemical studies inherently as well. So what do you do with membranes? Well, you don't have a chapter on membranes. What you do is you incorporate membranes as and when they're important right the way through the biology that you're talking about. And another example, there are many, but another one that caused us great problems in divvying up the work as authors was photosynthesis. Where do we bring photosynthesis into this? It comes into ecology because of the way plants manipulate their environments. It comes into structural biology. It comes into membranes again, and it comes into biochemistry. So you should find photosynthesis referred to and described from lots of different points of view at lots of different points in the book. And I think that's valuable. It means that we don't have isolated subjects that compartmentalize knowledge too strictly, because that's not how life is. It's certainly not how biology is.
Right, great. And then we touched on how UK curricula are very heavily research-led, very often reflect the specialisms of different departments. Kay, how have we reflected that in our approach?
Yes, every single fact in the book that we have and all the concepts have to be developed from somewhere, and they've been developed from research. So research is the fundamental cornerstone of what gives rise to science, and biology is no exception to that. And so that massive effort, that scientific method, has to be acknowledged in the book. And so what we've done is that we've got research, little kind of case studies that point to where some of the fundamental research has come from. And that's very much split out into, well, what is the question? What's the hypothesis? What was the methods that were developed to answer that? What were the results and how were they interpreted? So going through those methods is hugely important. And research is and will always be the cornerstone of the biological sciences, and I think it's important to understand that. And certainly, that's what you lead to towards the end. You lead towards your final year research project, where you are taking part in some primary research of your own. Not only do you have to then understand the facts, but you've got to have that curiosity and that drive to be able to answer those questions. And so your curriculum will give you that, and the book that is part of supports the curriculum will also give you that excitement of discovering something new. And that is what drives us as researchers all the way through our careers, is to find something new and to sit it in a wider context.
Right, great, thank you. And before we move over to the Q&A, just thinking about kind of bright spots in terms of current teaching practices and in terms of improving student educational outcomes, and ways in which we've reflected those bright spots in pedagogical approaches we've used in the project. Thinking, for example, about active learning. Kay, you want to reflect on how we've drawn upon that?
Yes, active learning can come in all sorts of different varieties. So research itself is active learning because you're doing it and you're applying your knowledge. But doing the questions, reading the case studies, that is active learning. Anything which is engaging your thought processes enables you to be an active learner. And the education resources that sit with the book. So the electronic resources enables you to do that as well. The case studies are vital to that immersive active learning approach that we want to get across in the book and its accompanying materials. Passive learning just is not adequate. You've got to be actively participating in the learning in order to actually understand it and to be excited by it. And I think that above all, I think that comes out in the book about how excited we all are about our different parts of biology, and we wanted to bring that across in the book about what an amazing science it is.
Yeah. When we were talking the other day, Alison, you said things in terms of it being fun.
Yes, I got very enthusiastic because I'm a great believer in students having fun while they're learning. And this is a textbook, but there are lots of different things to do. You can stop and look at the pause and think questions. There's a lot of information and different types of specialist boxes where you can find out about real world applications of the science, or you can find out how something was discovered, how we know it. And there are, at the end of the chapter, there are graded questions as well. So simple questions, more challenging questions. So I think this is a book that will allow students to interact with it in lots of ways, which does mirror the classroom approach that we're going for these days.
I guess the other approach that's sort of come to the fore during the pandemic is blended learning, John.
Absolutely, yes. And I think lots of institutions have been on a remarkably rapid journey in terms of learning how to develop blended learning. But again, within the biosciences, that's something we've been doing for quite a long time. And we've engaged with a range of people in helping us develop the book to produce various blended different media. So as I mentioned before, there are the video materials, there's interactive quizzes, there are a range of illustrations. And we thought very carefully about how they're designed and how they feed in to the book, so that, again, they support, in particular, conceptual understanding, because for some students, reading the text isn't enough. We know that students learn in different ways, and for some of them, looking at interpreting the figures and working their way through those is really useful. And for others, the video material is a great backup. And again, the explanations and the linkages that feed through from there are really, really helpful, particularly, again, in trying to get across these liminal concepts that I mentioned before, the threshold concepts, where students find these challenging, presenting the material in different ways and getting the students to think about it in different ways is a real way of fostering their understanding.
Great, thank you. And lastly, before we go to the Q&As, just to touch on the biomedical edition, John, if we stay with you, just to talk about our rationale for that.
Yeah, so again, I mean, we're all, as I mentioned before, we're all first year lecturers. We've all taught for a number of years in first year, and we know that many universities have a twofold structure. It's a broad generalization, but a lot of them have a broad-based biosciences program, which would represent the full scope of the book, but also many have biomedical type programs with specialisms within different areas of biomedical sciences, not just the traditional biomedical sciences, which is the vocational course, but also areas like medical physiology, medical biochemistry, and so on. And so there will also be a biomedical version of the book, which focuses on those core areas that are of direct relevance to students following a biomedical route. So it is the molecular biology, the cell biology, and the physiology as the core areas of that, so that we're looking at targeting the book to the different audiences who would find it most relevant.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. We'll move on to the Q&As, and I think Steph's going to magically appear to help compare this bit there.
Yes, thank you, John, and thank you to the authors for what's been a really interesting webinar. I'm hoping that these questions will provide further food for thought. So I'll start with a question that's come from somebody listening. who kind of talks a little bit more about the challenges that students face and also problems with how the structure of how biology is taught. And they ask, isn't it part of the problem with biology students in the UK not receiving perhaps the most grounding education across the spectrum of biological sciences, and the lack of systems-based teaching of the biosciences? And they mention various things about the fact that we require from students to bring up different elements of across their whole course. And how do we maybe cater to that? How do we support students having to make those connections, particularly in assessment across different areas of biology?
Shall I kick off with that one? It's quite a big question, isn't it? I think it touches on, to start with, on what Martin was saying about the breadth of the subject and the way in which we approach it, so that we know that there are some students who will come in knowing what they want to do. There are others who are doing a broad-based biosciences, and they might have decided they wanted to be, forgive me, Kay, a microbiologist or whatever, and get converted to being a good neuroscientist. And part of that is because their backgrounds within A-level courses or within the curricula that they've come from haven't enabled them to engage fully with all the different areas of biosciences. And that's something that we're looking at really carefully or we have looked at really carefully with this book. So they've got that broad-based approach and can draw the connections between the different elements and find the part of biosciences that excites them even more than their excitement about the general breadth of the subject as a whole. So that's something that we thought about really carefully in terms of the design.
Thank you. Okay, I'll move on to the next question then. One from OUP, if that's okay. Is there anything particular about your book that does anything particularly differently compared to other biology texts? What does your book do differently, basically?
Can I pick up a bit, because
you may.
Is that all right? Because I've talked about the fun side already, but I thought I might pick up a little bit more on my grumpy side, which is thinking about the very firm foundations. So we talked about the importance of concepts, but when students say, oh, I get the concept, that's often a little bit of a red flag to me. It means I haven't really studied this. I don't really get it, but I've got a very vague, woolly idea what it's about. And I'm really quite firm about the really firm foundations that students need to have, because once they've got those very firmly in their sights, then they can move on and up and take flight in their knowledge and their understanding and move into that research-based world. So one of the things that I think this book does really well is to set out some really firm foundations, and John really nurtured us through the idea of threshold concepts on that. So I think that's the other thing besides the fun that I would emphasize.
For the purposes of the group, do you think you could maybe define what you mean by threshold concepts, just to make sure that everybody's clear on what we mean by that?
So John Crow, I'm talking about, had encouraged us to really think about, what are the concepts that we really need to bring out for students to pick up in each of our chapters. We kind of had them red flagged across the learning outcomes of the chapters. Just to say, these are the concepts that you really need to grasp, because we're going to keep building on those. We're going to refer back to those. And we also have the supporting videos that would support those threshold concepts. So I think those are fun as well, because they give students a very quick introduction to those, and then we build upon them in the text.
So it's also about concepts that you have to know before you can understand something else as well, isn't it? So you've got to understand something about the fundamentals of the structure of DNA before you can understand something about mutagenesis, for example, the effects that mutations can have in terms of evolution, but also manipulated mutations, deliberate ones as well. So it's those threshold concepts, and we sat, I remember, in a room for a very long time thinking about, well, what concepts would you need to know for your particular area before something else could then be taught. And it's about drawing those out across the different modules, which is very important. And looking at those threshold concepts is something that the students reading the book need to do, because getting a hang of those and understanding those will enable them to access the knowledge in other areas of the book.
Thank you. All right, I'll move on to another question from somebody listening. They ask, you have clearly made the decisions to give your book a particular direction, which I appreciate, I would add. But every decision comes with consequences for other elements. What are some of the sad consequences of some of your decisions? For example, any topics that needed to be left out?
That's a leading question, isn't it? I mean, you really can't expect us to point out the gaps, but there are bound to be some, and I think it's for the readers to find the gaps and maybe to tell us about them for the second edition. But one of the things that I've struggled with right the way through, as I said earlier, I'm dealing largely with organismal biology, and in order to do that, I've had to draw examples from right across the biological world. And every time I bring up a new type of organism or a new group of organisms, I suddenly think, well, have I really explained everything there is to explain about that group of organisms sufficient for the student to understand what I'm banging on about? And at some point you have to draw the line. You have to say, okay, I'm going to use this as an example. I'm going to explain just enough, because if I go any further, I'll have to create a whole new chapter explaining what this group of animals is all about. So I've had to draw lines right the way through. I think that's what I'm trying to say. I guess that's no bad thing. It's a first level biology book. We can't give students all the information there is out there. We have, as we said before, we have to point them in the right direction and give them the understanding so they themselves can cope with the material that's missing, in a sense. But there are undoubtedly gaps.
I think that's inevitable. As Martin says, I think all the way along the line, we've had to think about the material that we're covering and where do you draw the line as to where you stop in terms of the depth into which you're going into it, because one can go into inordinate depth. Most of us, I'm sure, I know we all also teach and have experience of teaching on final year courses, and we know the depth even to which those go, and they don't go far enough in terms of the full understanding of that subject. So going back to the important element, which is this is designed as a first year book that will take first year undergraduates from their pre-university through to the beginning of the second year of level 5 of the, we use the FHEQ nomenclature, so that they're starting on that specialization journey, and then it's up to them which areas they follow up on in more detail. So yes, there will be gaps. Yes, there are limits, but we've designed it so that it's within the reach and the framework for a good first year student.
Thank you. I'll add another OUP question for now, if that would be okay. Of the teaching practices or interventions you have adopted or developed in your own teaching, which do you think has had the most impact?
I think for me, it was developing a level 5 second year research skills module, and that was about introducing students to research, but in a very structured way. And throughout our practical programs, I think I would say that our level 4, our first year students, when they're in the practical classes, they would learn specific techniques. So you'd learn how to use a pipette, for example, or learn how to use a spectrophotometer. And you gradually transition that knowledge, that technical understanding into research. And I wanted to bridge something. I wanted to kind of bridge that gap between something which was level 6, final year, and that middle part, the second year. So bringing in a research skills module is important, I feel. And what I love about this book is the research elements that we have in there, which brings an understanding to the student of what research actually is. Because I've done some research myself on research perceptions, and it's many of our students consider research just to be finding out a fact, and that isn't what we would consider research to be. Research is new to all, and I think that being able to bring those concepts across, I think, is really, really important to our students.
Thank you, Kay.
There's one more question I've seen from Pilar in the chat, so saying, would you say your book is adequate for students of an engineering degree who do not feel uneasy with mathematics, rather the contrary? It's a really good question. I'm just thinking about that. When I think from my perspective, I say we provide a lot of support, but the quantitative toolkits, which are our main vehicle for doing that, are self-contained. Deliberately they're early in the book, so they're an obvious part of it. But it means that the support is there without it getting in the way if you don't need it. So it gives that extra layer of flexibility for students who do feel more confident, and it's there to support those who don't. So I think it's kind of best of both worlds there. I would say, I don't know if anybody else feels differently, but
I think it depends a bit what the engineering degree is, but I'm assuming it might be something that would be aiming towards biomedical engineering, where the students might have a stronger background in the physical sciences and less strong background in the biological sciences. And I think it would be super suitable for that, because it's at a level where it could support students and at the same time it would challenge them. I don't think it would be boring for them, and it also would introduce them to a really broad range of different biological disciplines in which engineering could be applied. So I actually think it could be really good for a program like that. I don't know if that's the kind of program Pilar meant, but if it is, then yes.
Okay. On that note, we are rapidly approaching the hour, so I think we'll bring the webinar to a close. So I just wanted to say big thanks to Martin, to Alison, to John, and to Kay for being part of the session. Thanks to my colleagues Stella White and Katie Holland in our marketing team for making this happen. Thank you for Steph too for being there to support us, and thank you all for being there to join and to engage with us. And do please look out for details of the future webinars we'll be hosting in the new year when we're talking about other elements of the project in more detail too. For now though, thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.